Greetings everyone, I am Dr. J. 2023 was quite the year for video games, wasn't it? It's rare to get so many high-profile critical and commercial successes within a single year, and we were blessed with Tears of the Kingdom being one of them. However, precisely because of how well regarded it was, I find that it's often after the dust settles and everyone has had time to thoroughly explore the game that it becomes the most interesting to discuss. It's one thing to be well liked on release, but what sort of staying power does it have? Were there any updates after the fact that made it better or worse? And once the recency bias has withdrawn, is it still as good as we think it is? Thus, we are here today to ask and answer a simple question. Was The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom really worth all the fuss? With regard to that question, I feel that I have a unique perspective to offer. After all, I may be one of very few people that, gun to my head, would rate Breath of the Wild a 6 out of 10. And just to be clear, I don't mean by game journalist standards where anything below a 7 is a burning trash fire. I mean that it's definitely a cut above the average, but was unable to wholly overcome my strong disdain for open world elements. Yes, we will get into why I hold that stance, but because of it, I was very curious to see if this game would shake things up in a way that would allay my concerns. With that in mind, let's get into it, starting with the main story. The game takes place a few years after the events of Breath of the Wild, and following the defeat of Calamity Ganon, some normalcy has begun returning to Hyrule. However, a strange blight the game calls Gloom has been surfacing lately, and seeking answers, Link and Zelda descend deep below Hyrule Castle. Their exploration leads them to unearth what appears to be ancient paintings depicting the formation of Hyrule as a kingdom, and the influence of a people called the Zonai in the endeavor. Further on, they find what seems to be the cause of the gloom, a dehydrated body with a hand that seemingly binds it, and before they can properly respond, the apparent seal breaks, allowing whoever it is to badly damage the Master Sword, greatly weaken Link, and toss the pair into the depths below. Were it not for what appears to be some sort of power from Zelda, that may have been the end, but when Link wakes up, he finds himself spoken to by a spirit calling himself Rauru, who seems to know much about him and Zelda. After collecting himself and spending a few fleeting moments with Rauru, all Link has to go on is a whisper from Zelda that he has to find her, with the damaged Master Sword swept up by some kind of strange power. Also, it would appear that major shifts have happened across Hyrule when whatever Link and Zelda found started acting up, as numerous floating islands appeared, alongside numerous entrances to a massive network of caves below Hyrule's surface. To make matters stranger, it seems that everyone has their own brand of trouble caused by all of this, such as a dense blizzard completely engulfing Rito Village, and a strange sludge appearing that threatens to make Zora's domain toxic to its inhabitants. Thus, once Link has gotten back in the groove of seeking out shrines to slowly restore his strength, he descends to a major outpost and is left to explore Hyrule once again, seeking to put an end to the troubles availing the land. It's a solid plot hook to get us back into the swing of things. Since not everyone will be entering this with in-depth knowledge of Breath of the Wild, resetting progress this way gives the game an opportunity to ensure we know what we're doing, and to introduce the replacements to the Sheikah abilities we had before. It also helps set up the main villain as someone threatening, not just by imposing the power resets, but also shattering the Master Sword. It also means, since we're not re-entering the story 100 years after a climactic event, that much more of the active events can take place in front of us, eliminating a major criticism I had of Breath of the Wild. That said, the game does struggle when it comes to the world building. The individual stories told do well enough, as there's plenty of intrigue to be had based on what came before, such as Sidon being incredibly protective due to losing his sister before the prior game began. However, when it comes to the world building, good luck trying to make sense of it. Somehow all of the Sheikah technology is up and vanished to make way for the new Zonai gimmicks, without explanation. Even though something powerful like the Divine Beasts may have been really useful for the final battle, you'd wonder if they even still exist based on how little is said about them. As while there are more pressing concerns, you'd think there would be comments about people wishing they were around to assist. Perhaps I didn't explore enough to find them, but still, the fact that I can't recall anything outside of one talk with Impa leaves me dumbfounded. And yes, I know there was a developer interview where they tried to give a hand-wavy explanation of everything mysteriously vanishing, but I have two problems with that response. For one thing, that's a feeble excuse. It's not like it's the spirits of King Roman the Champions now put to rest after Calamity Ganon's defeat or some such. We're talking physical objects that could still be powered for all we know, including the Sheikah Slate they have to replace with basically the same device except with a different aesthetic. That stretches the suspension of disbelief quite a bit. Second, put that in your game if it's actually true. If I have to go to an outside source to learn something critical, such as where all the cool life-saving tech from the first game went, that's not a sign of good storytelling. And that's before we get into the Zonai themselves, because if the Zelda timeline wasn't already confused enough, now we have them gumming up the works. First off, we've got the two main figureheads in the obligatory flashback scenes, namely Rauru and Sonia. Rauru has the cool light powers, while Sonia is able to use time manipulation on objects, and they also happen to be married, as the first king and queen of Hyrule. Even though by the end of Skyward Sword, Zelda seemingly has all of the powers Rauru does, so does this somehow take place before the war that forced Hylians to take shelter on Skyloft? Is this sometime after the event, and the powers manifested differently through the generations? Or is this just another case where the writers really should have left any possible timeline ambiguous? And why did we never hear about you intervening any other time Ganondorf shows up? In the moments, the characters are pleasant to have around, but the world building is once again all kinds of wonky. At least the voice acting for those sections is still good. I'm someone who found Zelda's voice to be distracting in Breath of the Wild due to how different it is from prior iterations, but now that I've had time to get used to it, and now that the actress has had time to make the role her own, I've warmed up to it quite a bit. It marks a solid contrast between her and everyone around her, especially for the flashback scenes where she's been flung into a different era. Though, as well done as the flashback scenes are, I will admit to being distracted during them for a different reason, as all I could do was wonder whether this was a Crimson Flower route where the Flame Emperor lost. Yes, this is another "I'm hearing the same actors way too bloody often" complaint, because after playing way too much Fire Emblem, there were predictable results.
I've heard a great deal about you from Zelda.
Wait.
Your wounds were severe. I am relieved to see you escape death.
Hi, Dimitri.
Ah well, at least Rauru and Sonia ended up being the only two, so as long as there aren't too many others, I suppose I'm complaining over nothing.
It is our desire to be accepted into the protective embrace of your kingdom. To serve it faithfully.
Note to self, localizers are normie scum, avoid like plague. Yes, I am being facetious, yes, he does a good job, but yes, it's still distracting. Still, given that the majority of your time will be spent on gameplay over story, so long as the individual stories are told well and the gameplay is compelling, I suspect few people will have reason for complaint. With that in mind, let's talk gameplay. For the unfamiliar, Tears of the Kingdom is a third-person action adventure, with the game having a healthy mix of puzzle solving, exploration, and combat. The combat is pretty straightforward, as you can use bows to strike from range, and a variety of melee weapons categorized by one-handed, two-handed, and spears, with newfound ways to modify your melee weapons and the shields you use alongside one-handed weapons. One of the new abilities introduced allows you to fuse materials you find out in the world to said weapons and shields, and while most of them will just offer a power boost, it also means you can do crazy things like turn your shield into a flamethrower, to where all you have to do is hold down the lock-on button and watch them burn. Probably for the best that you can't do it in perpetuity, and that it doesn't do a lot of damage, and that you need to search for the materials to manage it, or else that would get a little too easy to abuse. Speaking of item rarity, I suppose this leads us nicely into the main reason why I dislike open world games. Growing up, every game I played had a very clear difficulty curve, even games with procedural generation like Diablo. As a result, when I encountered a problem, I could reasonably assume that I either had all the tools needed to get past it and just needed to get good, or there was some kind of balance issue. Since I ended up gravitating to strategy games and RPGs, that then means game balance is second only to usability when I'm critiquing gameplay. And open world games, by virtue of allowing you to go anywhere you like, are next to impossible to properly balance, especially for games with any sort of progression system. When you're starting out, you'll naturally be learning how to use the controls properly, which on top of having a weak character can lead to a steep learning curve before you're competent at the game. Once you're past that, you end up running into two problems, both of which are caused by the fact that the developers can't make any assumptions about when you'll be taking on each challenge. On one end of the spectrum, you can easily end up over your head if you wander into an area you're just not well equipped for. Once that happens, your choice can be to bash your head against the wall, frustrating yourself until it's eventually mastered, or you can mark it to look at later. The former is self-explanatory for why we'd want to avoid it, but whenever someone tells me to just do the latter, all I can do is blankly stare in annoyance. Yes, I can mark it, but will I remember what that mark meant by the time I return to it? Even if I do, I hate leaving something half-finished. So now that I know it's there, it's going to be nagging me as that thing I need to deal with at some point. On the other end of the spectrum, once that we built our character up and become fairly good at the game, with how much similar content often needs to be included to fill an open world game, a lot of it can end up being uninteresting and repetitive. The assumption most developers have to make is that an individual player will seldom see everything their game has to offer, so there's often a point where you've exceeded where most challenges can touch you, either because you built up so many resources to where you can handle it, or have drilled the gameplay down to a science and now find it akin to busy work. However, now that I've likely started some heated arguments in the comments, let's flip that on its head by saying the game managed to avoid the worst of my annoyances through how they introduced the wider world. Right as you leave the tutorial area, you're told by the quest log to go visit an outpost where the scientist Pura is located, at which point you get caught up to speed on the local problems in each region. Along with those problems, she also offers suggestions on which place you should go to first. Between that and another quest you get from the same outpost that requires you to go near Rito Village, you're encouraged to resolve the problems there first, allowing them to more naturally strengthen both Link and your opponents alongside each other. This then led the difficulty curve to feel more natural, as whenever one local concern was resolved, there was always a suggestion on what to tackle next, meaning there were far fewer instances where I was either bashing my head against a brick wall or just mindlessly coasting through an encounter. The way I took down enemies didn't often vary, but there were enough subtle differences in power level and the equipment required that, in concert with everything else, the game was better able to hold my attention. Though, I suspect part of this is because I also had foreknowledge of some systems from Breath of the Wild. I didn't need to be told about Flurry Rush, where if you dodge an enemy attack at the last second, you get to wail on him without fear of retaliation. I also didn't need to be told some of the nuances of cooking, where in order to get healing items, you can scavenge them out in the world, as well as combine them over a campfire to make something more potent, alongside potentially adding some other buff like resistance to a certain damage type. Even though my knowledge wasn't comprehensive, I knew enough to where I was pretty quick to get back into the swing of things. Before we move on though, there is one returning feature that can be quite contentious, and that's the fact that weapon durability is still present. The game may be willing to give you a myriad of weapons and a very slow way to increase how many you can carry at once, but that comes with a major caveat that all of them save the Master Sword will eventually break. In theory, this encourages you to explore and try out new equipment, adding another degree of resource management. In practice, it was something that I despised in Breath of the Wild, because the cool weapons you got from the main story often didn't stick around long enough to have a lasting impact, assuming that I felt comfortable even using them out of fear of needing them later. Instead of being this nice reward, it felt like an albatross around my neck, given the cost required to repair them. This time, I still don't like it, given that you don't always have a good option to find a solid weapon, but I'm more willing to accept it as a necessary evil due to the material fusion ability. With that available, there is at least a minimum standard that you can bring a weapon up to based on the monsters you've defeated, which means there isn't the same sense of risk associated with using a really strong weapon in favor of something weaker. This is especially the case since you have effectively bottomless pockets for materials, so you don't have to concern yourself with having the inventory space for a specific weapon, just the material you want to graft onto it. I could see the game becoming tedious if you run out of the good stuff and have to kill something stronger to get back to a prior power level, but thankfully that's not something I encountered. The only thing I struggled to have enough of were arrows and bombs, and even that was an occasional concern due to the ways you have to restock both after a while. I was also much happier with the dungeon design, as before they had eschewed the traditional themed dungeons in favor of 4 divine beasts, which all had the same or similar gimmicks to get through them. This also meant, to go back to my game balance concerns, the first one can end up being rather difficult, and then the rest are progressively easier to complete, since the game can't guarantee the order that you'll be facing them. This time, however, there are unique gimmicks for each of the levels, which introduce and give you the chance to master tricks you can use for the rest of the game. To use the earliest example, in trying to solve Rito Village's ails, you're sent with a young Rito to investigate whatever is causing the blizzard, which leads you to the first dungeon. The young Rito is able to generate a gust of wind that you can use alongside a paraglider to reach areas you otherwise couldn't, and this power is also required in order to reach the dungeon boss. That said, it's not a total return to tradition, as the fact that we don't have unique power-ups like the hookshot means there's only oh so much puzzle solving that can be done, and the Zonai Powers we'll be discussing soon can also mean if you want to cheese the dungeons, you can. It's neat that you can do so to an extent, but at the same time, if you really like the unique puzzle solving you get from the main dungeons in Ocarina of Time or Twilight Princess, that's not going to be found here. Still, compared to Breath of the Wild, I do consider this an improvement, especially from a game balance perspective. For the first dungeon, since it's still very much the early game, and there was an understanding that numbskulls like me would try to rush towards it to get rid of the obnoxious blizzard, the boss itself is one that isn't a straight up fight, but instead a skill check, by requiring you to hit specific weak points a few times while in the air, rather than having to chip down a sizable health bar. After that point, they could start to stack more health on the boss monsters, compelling me to spend more time on exploration. But even then, each had a unique gimmick that was oftentimes couched in the unique ability of the character accompanying you. The unique spins don't even stop there, as the shrines are rather varied and all take full advantage of the new powers at your disposal. Before we delve too far into puzzle solving, it should also be noted that there are a few shrines geared around combat, but those appear to be less frequent, and there's more variety to them. Some of them will offer combat tutorials, others include enemies as part of their puzzle rooms, while others decide, oh, all that fancy equipment you have? Leave it at the door. You need to figure out how to manage with whatever table scraps are lying around. I likely encountered those shrines with more health than it's probably intended, but regardless of that, the challenge itself encourages you to learn how to improvise and adapt, a habit that can pay dividends out in the wider world, reducing any frustration one might encounter with the open world elements in the process. And then there are the puzzle rooms themselves. Let's start with the new powers you're given and work our way from there. The first power you're granted allows you to pick up and move anything other than terrain, people, or enemies, as well as allows you to stick them to each other. This ends up being your bread and butter, as it doesn't matter whether it's a wooden raft, a Zonai device, or even something as complex as a wagon, it can pick it up and it can tack it onto other objects. To make all of this interesting, there are a whole host of Zonai devices this can work in tandem with, ranging from fans that can propel you across the water or sky, simple constructs for gliding across the sky or ground, to elemental effects like the flamethrower. In order to trigger something with an active effect, one only has to hit it, though outside of shrines you have an effective stamina bar with a battery pack at Link's waist, which is thankfully kept separate from the actual stamina bar that says how long Link can sprint, climb, swim, or glide before getting tired. It can also be upgraded, with the materials to do so being found in abundance in the depths if you're able to manage the tougher challenge. As a quick side note, I do like how they manage that challenge. Instead of just throwing tougher enemies at you, the monsters in the depths are usually affected by the gloom, which means when they hit you, they don't just hurt, but also prevent you from healing it back without either returning to a save point or using specific materials when cooking up healing items. As a way to differentiate the depths from the surface, it's a solid move that also ensures that you generally spend more time on the surface, where the options to scavenge and explore are more varied. To get back to the Zonai powers, the telekinesis and adhesive opens up a lot of options for traversal and puzzle solving all on its own. And that's before mentioning how it wasn't until I was dozens of hours in that I stopped finding unique Zonai devices. To further make things interesting, the next power is a time rewind, where once you've selected the option, time stops, and by hovering the crosshair over an object, you'll see where it's been and where it'll travel to if selected. This then means if you want to go near the start of a river that has debris in it, you can stop time, move the crosshair over some of that debris, hop on, and watch as it moves against the current. There are some really neat applications for this, as hitting the rewind button also resets any effect that physics was having on it prior to the rewind. This then meant a shrine could present a neat puzzle where you have to rewind time until a ball was hovering over a gap in a ramp, where it would then just fall straight down to where you want it. They even made sure that was the only solution by putting it out of telekinesis range. The shrines weren't especially challenging, even if you push yourself to also unlock the optional chest in each one, but they made for a nice diversion alongside the usual trekking and fighting through the overworld. The only kind of puzzle that I wasn't too thrilled with were any that required you to move an object from one point to another, as those were often exercises in tedium. Some of the shrines had this as their sole gimmick, where you have to find an object and bring it somewhere else, oftentimes relying on either whatever materials are on hand or your own guile to get it there. Outside of those shrines, you can build up a nice horde of Zonai devices, and I never ran into trouble getting more due to how infrequently I used the Zonai charges required to get them. But a fair number of challenges could easily boil down to just hitting the telekinesis button and walking slightly slower than normal, which isn't all that exciting after getting used to sprinting everywhere. And if that wasn't enough, they used this as a new gimmick for the Koroks as well, which for the unfamiliar are little creatures that can be found through a bunch of different means, and offer you the chance to increase your max weapon limit. Given that there's hundreds of the little blighters, if I see another Korok with an oversized backpack trying to reach his friend that's sending up a green smoke signal, it'll be too soon. I mean, seriously, you couldn't even change up whether we had to move 2 Koroks at once, or something as basic as a different color in the smoke signal? They do try to vary the environmental obstacles in your way, such as putting a river in between you and the objective. But since I eventually found a couple of one-size-fits-most solutions, it got old really quickly. Oh yeah, there's technically 2 more Zonai powers, aren't there? One of them is unlocked at a certain point in the depths, where you'll be wanting to rely on Zonai devices for traversal more so than otherwise. At that point, you're given access to a build history feature that lets you use raw materials and/or individual components to make something for you, and can find starting templates by exploring the depths. One of the first you're likely to unlock lets you take a hot air balloon and put a simple basket underneath, which I abused the heck out of whenever I was looking to find one of the routes you need to interact with in order to see more than 5 feet in front of you. Well, unassisted anyway. They do offer equipment and materials that can help with this, but you'll eventually want to reach them so you don't have to throw bright bloom seeds everywhere. Another Zonai power was the odd one out, by allowing you to find a point in the terrain above and phase through it to the top. I will admit to forgetting this exists a couple of times due to how anachronistic it is compared to the rest, but you'll want to remember it given how many caves, wells, and upper floors there are to reach that don't have an easy way to make it there without it. It's not used a whole lot for explicit puzzle solving, but it's a nice thing to have. And with those tools at our disposal, we're set loose on the world and allowed to go in basically any direction we want. This is the part that wowed everyone when Breath of the Wild released, and much of that carries over into this one. To encourage that sense of exploration, you've got horses for faster traversal, if you even bother with that now that the Zonai devices are here, shrines and novel structures to lead you to start marching in a specific direction, and plenty to encounter along the way, from Korok hunting to exploring caves and monster outposts to side quests from travelers and townsfolk. As before, it strikes a good balance between offering enough structure to give you reason to scour the landscape, but not so much that you're beholden to it if you really want to check out a specific part of the map. I suspect that even after giving myself so much time with the game, that there's still plenty of side quests and small stories that I've overlooked, to where if you really like the open world part of this game, you won't be at a loss for things to do. Supporting this is a decent user interface and control scheme, though not a perfect one. The majority of the UI is good enough for what the game needs, with the crucial information readily available, and with the game pausing if you ever need to bring up a menu. That said, the way they handle sifting through materials for fusing to arrows is clunky to say the least. They do give sword options, but when you get into the late game and it takes more than a few seconds to cycle through the list until you find what you're looking for, even with those sword options, it starts to have a negative effect on the pacing. As for the controls themselves, this is one case where I'll likely break from the norm, as I don't actually mind the motion controls. It took a bit of getting used to when playing Skyward Sword and replaying Metroid Prime last year, but in this case, the motion controls are confined to using the gyro for aiming a bow or thrown weapon, and moving materials with the telekinesis power. Since I grew up a PC gamer, analog aiming is something I struggle with more so than gyro aiming. So unless my opponent dashes past me and I have to turn around quickly, I can usually aim more quickly using the latter than the former. For the telekinesis ability, that's where it's less useful, to where I basically ignored it, as it works in a way that's not exactly precise, but also too slow to be used for sweeping movement. By the end of it, all I wanted was a way to toggle what specific features had motion controls and which ones didn't. Though, at least the motion control for telekinesis was so negligible that I could largely ignore it. Overall, Tears of the Kingdom is for me what Breath of the Wild should have been. While the different expectations may have played a role in that, there is a lot that Tears of the Kingdom improves upon. Between adding new areas to explore, adding greater variety to the shrines and dungeons, and having more of the important story beats happen in front of us rather than as flashbacks. Though there is that small part of me that's reticent to recommend a $70 game in cases where there's not any DLC and we're given a complete package right off the bat, I can live with that being the price point. It's a solid expansion of what Breath of the Wild established, and offers plenty of worthwhile stuff to check out in its own right. In short, was Tears of the Kingdom really worth all the fuss? Absolutely. And thus, we come to the end of the review, but before we go, I'd like to look to what the future might hold for the franchise. As now that we're a year on and have heard more from the developers, I'm not sure what the next logical step is. Throughout the franchise's history, the trend was to file it down from the more open area of the first game to something more structured, with the franchise seemingly moving back to the more open world with Breath of the Wild and now Tears of the Kingdom. And yet, for people like me, whose first completed Zelda game was Twilight Princess, there is something I feel is missing with respect to what Tears of the Kingdom offered. What has me curious is that the leadership within Nintendo seems confused as to why someone like me would wish for a more linear game, as in their eyes, the quote set path we have in a game like Twilight Princess is there in spirit for a game like Tears of the Kingdom. It's just the path we personally chose to complete the game. While the full context does recognize that nostalgia might play a role, which I can agree with, I feel the statement misses the point. The limited structure of the old games meant I couldn't do as much as I can in Tears of the Kingdom, but just because I can do more things doesn't mean that wider variety will include the thing I'm looking for, as evidenced by my middling opinion of Breath of the Wild. As an example, I cannot always walk into a major dungeon in Tears of the Kingdom and assume I have the materials, gear, and weaponry I need in order to get through it, but I can say that for prior Zelda games. The way dungeons are laid out are much more explicitly geared to what you have at your disposal, usually favoring the new toy, but also integrating prior trinkets that ensure you're never just using what's right in front of you. Before Tears of the Kingdom came out, I played Skyward Sword to completion, and while it was overly reliant on motion controls, the dungeons in that game exemplified this. The Skyview Temple may have introduced the Flying Beetle to us, which we can use to pick up rupees and cut rope from a distance, but the Lanayru Desert then upgrades it to use in conjunction with bombs, with the ability to cut rope remaining relevant for opening up pathways in the Earth Temple. And yet, in the case of Tears of the Kingdom, because the developers can't make assumptions about what you'll have, they can't integrate cases where you have to, for instance, use Yunobo's power to clear away some debris in the Gerudo Temple. That then limits how creative puzzle solving can be, as we can't then have a moment where we need to use an old tool in a new way, or combining multiple tools in a novel manner, like the bomb and beetle example. One could also argue it means the unique powers can't be as, well, unique, as I can get the same effect as Yunobo's power by being stubborn with a blunt weapon or throwing some bombs at the problem. It's also something that can affect the story, as given Zelda's disappearing act, you get to explore a bit to piece together what she's been up to. And depending on when you unlock scenes, that can have an effect on how impactful said scenes are. The moment that best exemplified this is a point where Zelda takes a very specific action, and before it's done, I had a moment of wait, you wouldn't. That shocking moment where I had seen enough to guess at what was going to happen, but not enough to know for certain. Which then meant when it happened, I'm left floored in the best way possible. However, I found out later that, had I attended to a different character before retrieving the Master Sword, I would have been told directly that yes, this is the plan, which would have drastically reduced the impact of that scene. On one hand, I'm really glad that I experienced it the way I did. On the other hand, I can't guarantee that'll be everyone else's experience, which means not everyone will get the chance to share what I felt in that moment. Although part of the reason can also be pinned on the fact that Zelda really didn't need to spell it out to whom she was speaking to, but even having it merely hinted towards would have planted the seed early enough to where the shock wouldn't land as well. And while I'm going off on tangents, I would argue the flashbacks before the reveal were also overdone. But then again, Japanese media in general seems to overly favor flashbacks, as if they don't trust us to actually remember what we saw. So do I blame the trend or Nintendo for following it? Regardless, since the last two mainline entries have sold rather well, Nintendo has little reason to change course right now. But the success that the Skyward Sword and Link's Awakening remasters saw suggests that there's still a market of people like me who want something more structured. I don't know how easy it would be to create a new game instead of remastering an old one, but I see no reason why these two kind of games can't coexist. And yet, given what the higher-ups have said, I'm not confident that's the path they'll be following. I suppose if the next game can maintain what they have, they'll be alright, but if I never get a more linear Zelda game again, then I guess I'll just have to hope that someone else can come in and pick up the slack. However it shakes out, I wish Nintendo the best of luck for whatever they try their hand at next. And with that, we come to the end of the video. Thank you all for stopping by, and feel free to let me know how off-kilter I am in the comments below. I suspect there will be plenty of consternation over the open world comments especially, as I've been having a back and forth with my livestream chat over this topic for a while now. Granted, that might just be because I work better when I have a chance to properly order my thoughts, but if there's something I overlooked or poorly explained, I'd be happy to hear it, and continue the discussion on that. It might also be worthwhile to look back on some of the older Zelda games to offer a contrast, as there's plenty that I have yet to play still. Until then, thank you all once again for watching, and I'll see you all later.